just want to return briefly to something I was talking about a few days ago, which was to do with how ambiguous figures, images, two-dimensional images drawn on a page, kind of change, or seem to be, when they flip from one version of that ambiguous image to another, for me at least, they seem to be accompanied by certain relatively subtle embodied responses, or maybe it's the embodied activity which triggers the flipping and the ambiguity. I'm not quite sure. And I think what I may have mentioned in passing was Necker cubes. The Necker cube is an ambiguous image, which is basically just a skeletal drawing of a three-dimensional cube. But when you look at it, you can. When I say it's a skeletal image, I mean there's no solid sides. You can see through it to the parts of it which would be at the back. But when you look at it, you can see it in two ways. You can see it either as as kind of protruding towards you, in which case you can see the top surface of that cube, or you can see it in a different way, so that you seem to be looking at the lower surface of that cube. So sometimes it looks like a corner of a room, for example, and other times it looks like like you're looking down on a box or a dice. There's that kind of ambiguity to it. But what I've found, looking at those, and as I said about the other ambiguous figures, when you look at the Necker cube, what tends to happen is it spontaneously changes. You look at it for a while, your gaze just kind of wanders in a relatively unconscious way across the surface of the page, looking at the features. And at a certain point it'll just flip, and you'll see it one way and then you'll see it another way. And it seems to happen spontaneously. You can also do it by an act of will, as I've said before with these other ambiguous images, like the duck-rabbit image I was talking about, or the ambiguous figure of the older and younger woman I've talked about. Again, with the Necker cube, you do seem to be able to make it flip from one version to another version by an act of will. But what that act of will is I'm not so sure about. I don't like the term act of will, because it seems to be invoking the idea of will, which I'm not happy about as a term, really. I don't understand it enough to be able to feel comfortable about using it properly. So my interpretation of that, or what I'm trying to think of with that, is what kind of experiences am I having when I do that exerting of will, or when that spontaneous flipping takes place. And one of the things I've noticed is, and it's a really subtle effect, and it might even be illusory. What I'm noticing is that there are quite subtle changes taking place in, they're not exactly taking place in my body itself, but they're kind of taking place in the way that my body feels. And I think they're to do with habitual bodily states associated with particular sights and images and relationships and spatial relationships. So when I look at a Necker cube, and it seems to be an image of and it seems as if I'm looking down on the top of it, so it looks like a cube, a large box, let's say. When it looks like that, I can kind of feel a body state which associates with the action of standing in front of a cube and looking down. There's something going on in the angle of my head. There's something going on where my weight is distributed, where my the orientation of my torso. It's not exactly those things are changing. I can just feel there's a kind of readiness in those things to adopt a certain position, perhaps associated with how I would stand if I was looking down on something. If there was a box in front of me right now that I was looking down on, in the way that the Necker cube in that particular orientation seems to be, the chances are my head would be lowered slightly, my weight would be thrown forward slightly, different things would happen lower down in my body to compensate for that weight. I would have certain kinds of stresses in the muscles of my neck and my head. Perhaps my weight might feel a little bit different on the soles of my feet. That distribution would be different. I might hold my shoulders, my arms different, perhaps to compensate, or perhaps to begin to engage with the object. So it seems to me there's a whole kind of choreography of movement associated with looking down on an object, completely integrated and synergistic. to do with looking down on an object which feels like it's being slightly prepared for when I look at that image of a Necker cube in that orientation. And that's very different, I think, to what happens when I look at the Necker cube that seems to be kind of representing the top corner of a room. So you seem to be looking at the undersurface of it. It seems to be elevated. Even though the image itself, you know, if you're looking at this on a page, for example, and it's on a desk in front of you, even though that image hasn't changed, for me, what I get is a slightly different sense of where my body feels like it needs to be at that moment. Because I guess when I'm looking at a normal situation in which you would see that shape, the top of a room, the corner of a room, see that particular configuration of lines, your body would be in a different choreography. You would be looking up. Your head would be tipped back. Your chin would be out. The weight would be further back on your heels. Your chest would be elevated. Again, different things with shoulders, arms, different weight distribution on the feet. There's a whole different, as I said, there's a whole different schematic layout for that kind associated with that image. And I think I can kind of feel that, even when I'm just looking at a two-dimensional Necker cube, very skeletal image of a cube. When it's flipped into that other orientation, so I seem to be seeing the bottom, or I seem to be seeing the corner of a room, my body seems to be wanting to tell me that I'm standing, or wanting to adopt that position of standing in a slightly different way. It's a very subtle effect, and as I say, it might be hallucinatory, I might be just imagining it. But certainly in terms of will, in terms of this effort of will that I seem to be able to use, and we all seem to be able to use, I'm sure, that causes the Necker cube to flip from one orientation to the other, there does seem to be a relationship between those. If I consciously think about looking up and sort of begin to adopt the postures of looking up, you know, the stick my chin out a bit and move my weight back and do something with my chest, the Necker cube will flip on cue to that appearance of the corner of a room. And if I do the opposite thing, if I start to adopt the postures and the choreography associated with looking down on something, you know, tuck my chin in, put my head forward a wee bit, the Necker cube does tend to collapse back to the other orientation, where it seems to be a cube placed somewhere below eye level such that you can look down on it. It's interesting to me. I don't know if it's interesting to anybody else. Yeah, that's it really.